The morning I signed the papers on the house in Oakville, I remember thinking that 63 years of living had finally taught me something useful. That patience, not speed, was what separated a good decision from a regrettable one. I stood in the driveway after the lawyer left, just looking at the place. It was a solid two-story on a quiet street, the kind of house where you could hear the neighbor's lawnmower on a Saturday morning and not mind it at all. The previous owner, a retired school teacher named Mr. Beaumont, had kept the place immaculate. New roof, updated plumbing, a kitchen that didn't embarrass itself. I paid $340,000 for it, which was everything I had saved since my wife passed 4 years earlier, plus the equity from selling our old place in Hamilton. I wasn't a rich man. I was a careful one. My son Gerald was 34 at the time. He worked in logistics, driving routes between Toronto and Windsor, and he'd been renting a basement apartment in Mississauga for the better part of 5 years. When I mentioned I was buying the Oakville house, he called me that same evening, full of excitement, asking about the layout, the neighborhood, whether there was a second bedroom. I told him there were 3 bedrooms. He got quiet for a moment, the way people do when they're working up to asking something, and then he said he'd been thinking about saving money, about how his rent was eating him alive, about how it might be nice, just for a year or so, to get back on his feet. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. He moved in on a Thursday in late October, 3 years ago now. He brought 2 carloads of belongings, a good attitude, and his girlfriend, Paulette. I hadn't known Paulette was part of the arrangement. She was pleasant enough when she arrived, carrying boxes and smiling at me with the kind of smile that works very hard at being warm. She was 31, worked at a nail salon in Burlington, and she spoke quickly about everything: the traffic, the weather, the house, my garden, as if silence made her uncomfortable. Gerald introduced her as his girlfriend, not as someone who would be living with us. But by the end of that first evening, when her toiletries were in the upstairs bathroom and her shoes were lined up beside the front door, it was clear the question had been answered without being asked. I didn't make an issue of it. I'm not that kind of man. I told myself that young people do things differently now, that sharing a home doesn't carry the same weight it once did, that I should be grateful my son wanted to spend time near me rather than drifting further away. I made us all dinner that first night, a pork roast with carrots and potatoes, the same thing I used to make every Sunday when Gerald was a boy, and we sat together at the kitchen table, and it almost felt like something good. By December, Paulette's mother was staying in the 3rd bedroom. Her name was Denise. She was 57, a small woman with a loud opinion about everything, who had driven up from Street, Catherine's, because, as Paulette explained it, her mother was between apartments, as if that were a weather condition, something temporary and blameless that would pass on its own. I gave her the room. I even moved some of my boxes from the closet to make space. I told myself it was the right thing to do. It was winter. She had nowhere else to go. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know for another 4 months, was what was happening in my house while I was out. I had a routine. 3 mornings a week I volunteered at the library on Kerr Street, helping with their seniors' reading program. 2 mornings I had a standing coffee with my old friend Walter, who'd retired from the post office and liked to talk about hockey and local politics in equal measure. I was usually out of the house by 9 and back by noon or 1 o'clock. It never occurred to me that my absence was being treated as an opportunity. The call came on a Tuesday in early March. I was sitting in the parking lot of the library, finishing a coffee before going inside, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, but no name. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Is this Raymond Kowalczyk?" The voice was a man's, older, cautious. I told him it was. "This is Harold Beaumont," he said. "I used to own the house on Thornwood. I sold it to you last October." I remembered him immediately, a quiet, dignified man in his late 70s, who had lived in that house for 26 years and wept a little when he handed over the keys. I asked him how he was doing, and he said he was fine. He was living with his daughter in Guelph now, but that wasn't why he was calling. He told me he'd had a security camera installed in his living room about 3 years before the sale. One of those small ones, barely visible, mounted near the top of the bookshelf. He'd put it in after a break-in in the neighborhood, just to have some peace of mind. When he moved out, he thought he'd disconnected everything. But a few weeks ago, his granddaughter had been helping him set up his new laptop, and she'd found the old cloud account still active, still receiving footage. He paused there. I could hear him breathing. "Raymond," he said, "I think you need to come see this. Don't mention it to anyone in the house. Come alone." I sat in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up. The sky was the flat gray of a Canadian March, not quite willing to commit to winter or spring. I watched a woman push a stroller across the parking lot and thought about what Harold had just told me and tried to decide what I felt. Not panic, not anger, something quieter, something that felt more like clarity arriving after a very long fog. I called Walter and told him I had to skip coffee that week. Then I drove to Guelph. Harold met me at his daughter's house, a tidy bungalow on the east side of the city. His daughter, a woman named Caroline, who had her father's careful eyes, brought us tea and then excused herself without being asked. Harold sat across from me at the dining room table with a laptop open between us and a kind of sorrow on his face that I recognized. It was the expression of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. He had organized the footage by date. There were dozens of files. The first one he showed me was from a Friday in January, about 3 weeks after Denise had moved in. The angle was fixed on the living room, the couch, the coffee table, the shelf where I kept a few framed photographs, and my late wife's ceramic cardinal that I'd had since 1987. You could see most of the room and part of the hallway leading to the kitchen. In the video, Gerald left for work at 7:42 in the morning. I left at 8:51. By 9:15, Paulette and Denise were sitting at my kitchen table. You could see them through the hallway with papers spread between them. I couldn't hear everything, but Harold had turned up the audio as far as it would go, and I could make out enough. They were talking about property, about getting his name on something, about how long it would take before I got comfortable enough. I asked Harold to pause it there. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him to keep going. Over the next 2 hours, we watched several months of footage. Not all of it, but the pieces Harold had flagged. There was a video from February where Paulette was on the phone in the living room, speaking in a low voice, describing the house, the rooms, the lot size, what she estimated it might be worth. There was one from the same week where Denise was at my writing desk, opening the drawer where I kept household documents. She didn't take anything that I could see, but she was looking, reading, her finger trailing down a page. There was a longer recording from a Saturday in late February when both women had stayed behind while Gerald and I had gone to watch a minor league hockey game in Hamilton. Gerald had surprised me with the tickets, and I'd been genuinely touched by the gesture. Hadn't wondered at all why he'd been so keen to get me out of the house. In that recording, Denise made a phone call that lasted 40 minutes. I couldn't make out the whole conversation, but I heard my address repeated twice, and the phrase joint tenancy spoken clearly enough that there was no mistaking it. I understood then what I was looking at. I thanked Harold. I thanked him in a way I don't quite have words for, because what he had done, calling a stranger, organizing those files, driving none of this had been his responsibility, and he'd done it anyway. He waved it off, the way decent people do, and told me he was sorry I was dealing with it. His daughter walked me to my car. She squeezed my arm and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. I drove back to Oakville slowly, taking the back roads along the lake shore, because I needed the time. I want to be honest about what I felt on that drive. Not just the anger, which was there, a low and steady heat in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, but also something that surprised me. Grief. Not for Paulette, whom I barely knew, but for Gerald. For the version of my son I'd believed I was helping. I kept thinking about that pork roast on the first night, the three of us at the table, and how pleased I had been, how full of something I can only call hope. I had been foolish, but I had not been wrong to hope. Those are different things, and it took me most of that drive to understand the difference. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had made my decisions. The first thing I did, that same afternoon, was call my lawyer. Her name is Margaret Chu, and she has been handling my affairs since my wife's estate, and there is no one I trust more with anything that matters. I told her everything. She listened, without interrupting, which is one of her many fine qualities. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. Did I have copies of the footage? Was anything missing from my documents? And had anyone asked me to sign anything in the past few months? I told her I was arranging to get copies from Harold. I told her I would check my documents that evening. And I told her that yes, in fact, 2 weeks earlier, Gerald had mentioned in passing that it might be smart for me to have a secondary name on the property deed just in case something happened to me. I had told him I'd think about it, and then I hadn't thought about it at all. because the suggestion had made me vaguely uneasy in a way I hadn't examined at the time. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Raymond, don't change anything yet. Don't confront anyone. Don't move money. Just watch and let me work." That is exactly what I did. I was methodical about it, in the way that only patience teaches you to be. I went through my desk that evening while everyone was watching television downstairs. All my documents were there, the deed, the insurance papers, the investment account statements, but I photographed every page anyway with my phone and sent the images to Margaret. I checked my banking app and scrolled back through 3 months of transactions. Nothing was missing. But there was something that bothered me. A bill from a law firm I didn't recognize, tucked behind an electric bill, addressed to my house but not to my name. It was a consultation invoice. Whoever had been consulting them had used my address. I photographed that too. I sent everything to Margaret and went downstairs and joined my son and his girlfriend and her mother for the evening news, and I sat in my chair and watched the television and said nothing at all about any of it. That was the hardest part, if I'm being truthful, not the anger. The silence. Over the following 3 weeks, I observed. I noticed things I'd been too trusting to notice before. The way Denise sometimes drifted toward my desk when she thought I wasn't watching. The way Paulette would grow very still and attentive whenever I mentioned anything to do with finances or the house. The way Gerald would occasionally say things that sounded like they'd been rehearsed. Little comments about my age, about the stairs being difficult, about whether I'd thought about what would happen if my health declined. I loved my son. I want to be clear about that, because everything that followed can sound cold when written plainly, and I don't want to give the wrong impression. But loving someone and trusting them are two different things, and I had confused them. And the confusion had cost me several months of living under a scheme I hadn't seen because I hadn't wanted to see it. Margaret moved carefully. She contacted a property law colleague who specialized in fraud prevention and had him review the documents I'd photographed. He confirmed that the law firm invoice was from a firm that handled real estate title transfers. Someone had inquired about the process for adding a co-owner to an existing property deed. The inquiry had been made using my home address and Gerald's name as a contact. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She sent a formal letter to Paulette's mother, delivered by courier, addressed directly to Denise, informing her that as an unregistered occupant of a private residence, she had 30 days to vacate the premises, and that any action taken to alter, transfer, or encumber the property at that address, without the registered owner's explicit written consent, would be treated as fraud and referred immediately to the appropriate authorities. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was at the library. I came home at noon to find Denise in the kitchen with her coat on, her face the color of old concrete. Paulette was upstairs, moving around loudly. Gerald was sitting at the kitchen table looking at his hands. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Gerald looked up at me and said, "Dad, we need to talk." I sat down across from him. I folded my hands on the table. I waited. He tried several different approaches over the next 20 minutes. He said he hadn't known what Paulette and her mother were planning. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he'd been under a lot of pressure and had made some poor choices about who he listened to. He said he was sorry, several times, in the way that people say sorry when they're hoping the word itself will do the work of actual reckoning. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I told him I had seen the recordings. I told him I knew about the law firm. I told him I knew about the phone call Denise had made in February while we were at the hockey game, the game he had bought the tickets for. He went very still. I told him I didn't know exactly where the line was between being influenced by someone and being complicit with them, and that I supposed it didn't entirely matter, because the practical consequences were the same either way. I told him that Denise needed to be gone by the end of the month. I told him that Paulette needed to be gone by the same date. And I told him that his continued presence in my home would depend entirely on what the next several months showed me about who he actually was. I kept my voice level throughout. Not cold, I wasn't trying to be cruel, but level, steady. Because I had driven home along the lakeshore, and I had sat in my chair through 3 weeks of difficult evenings, and I had given myself enough time to know exactly what I needed to say, and saying it did not require volume or heat. Denise left within the week. She didn't speak to me directly again, and I didn't require her to. Paulette took longer, citing various practical difficulties, her work schedule, her lease on a storage unit, some paperwork she was waiting on, but by the date Margaret had specified in the letter, she was gone, Gerald stayed. He was quieter for a long time afterward. He helped around the house without being asked. He stopped making comments about my age, or the stairs, or what would happen if my health changed. One evening in May, he sat down across from me after dinner and said, without any rehearsal in his voice, that he was ashamed of himself, that he had told himself a story in which he wasn't really doing anything wrong, and that watching that story fall apart had been hard but necessary. I accepted that. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing ever fully resolves, and because accepting the truth of a moment is not the same as forgetting what came before it. There are things I want to say to anyone in a similar situation, because I have thought about them carefully, and I believe they matter. The first is this: a home is not just a financial asset. It is where you keep the things that cannot be replaced, the photographs, the ceramic cardinal, the 30 years of ordinary life that accumulate in the walls and the floorboards, and the particular light that comes through the kitchen window on a winter afternoon. Protecting that place is not selfishness. It is stewardship. The second is this: trust should be something people earn incrementally, not something handed over whole because of love or guilt, or the desire to avoid awkwardness. I made the mistake of assuming that because Gerald was my son, his intentions were automatically aligned with my well-being. That assumption left me vulnerable in ways I was too slow to notice. The people who love us can still make choices that harm us. Those two facts can exist together. The third is this: when something feels wrong, it usually is. I had felt something uneasy when Gerald mentioned the deed. I had noticed Denise's interest in my desk and told myself I was being uncharitable. I had watched Paulette grow, still at the mention of finances, and decided I was misreading her. Every one of those moments was a signal I chose to ignore because acknowledging it would have required a confrontation I wasn't ready for. The cost of avoiding that discomfort was months of exposure to something that could have become very serious. The discomfort, it turns out, is far less expensive than the alternative. And the fourth, which I say, not with bitterness, but with the clarity that comes from having been through something. The calmest response is often the most powerful one. I did not shout. I did not accuse anyone the moment I returned from Harold's house. I did not make dramatic gestures or ultimatums in the heat of the first awful feelings. I drove home slowly. I called my lawyer. I watched and documented, and let the facts build themselves into something undeniable. And when the time came to speak, I said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more. 63 years had taught me that. I was grateful, finally, that I'd listened to what they had to say. The house on Thornwood still stands exactly as it did when Harold Beaumont kept it. The roof is solid. The kitchen doesn't embarrass itself. The ceramic cardinal is on its shelf, where it has always been. On Saturday mornings, I can hear the neighbor's lawnmower, and I do not mind it at all. Gerald is still with me, and we are finding our way back to something, slowly and carefully. The way you navigate a road that has been damaged by frost, heave slowly, with attention, checking the ground before you put your weight on it. That is enough. For now, that is more than enough.